July 24th, 1944. Tinian Island, Marianas. 0 for 23 hours. The jungle breathed with malevolent life in the pre-dawn darkness. Insects droning in waves, fronds rustling with creatures unseen, the air so thick with humidity it felt like drowning on dry land. Private First Class. Frank Wittek lay in a shallow foxhole carved from volcanic soil and coral, his Springfield rifle cradled across his chest, every nerve ending singing with exhaustion and hyper-awareness. The Marine position, a hastily dug defensive perimeter on Hill 230, had been quiet for 90 minutes, long enough for fatigue to start dulling the edges of vigilance. Then the sound came. The soft scuff of rubber-soled boots on stone, the whisper of equipment shifting, the nearly imperceptible rustle of men moving through undergrowth with tactical precision. Wittek's hand tightened on his rifle. His mouth tasted of copper and fear. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, the Japanese were gathering, not for a probing attack or harassing fire, but for something concentrated, something final. The mathematics was simple and terrible. He was one Marine in an isolated position, and they were coming with everything they had. What happened in the next 18 minutes would shatter every assumption about what a single human being could accomplish when survival became the only equation that mattered. The coral dust coating his hands smelled like ancient death, like the compressed bones of organisms that had lived and died millennia before men brought their wars to these islands. Wittek pressed himself lower into the foxhole, feeling the volcanic rock dig into his ribs, and waited. With the Springfield, model 1903, the rifle that had served his father in the First War, felt impossibly heavy and impossibly light at the same time. 5 rounds in the internal magazine, 1 in the chamber. 6 chances before he'd have to reload, fumbling with stripper clips in the dark while men tried to kill him. The odds were arithmetic horror, but arithmetic had never accounted for what desperation could forge in the human animal. The invasion of Tinian, launched just 9 days earlier, was part of the larger Marianas campaign that aimed to seize islands close enough to mainland Japan for B-29 Superfortress bombers to operate. The island was small, barely 12 miles long, but strategically invaluable, with flat terrain perfect for airfield construction. American planners had estimated light resistance, and intelligence reports suggested the Japanese garrison numbered around 5,000, many of them construction troops rather than combat infantry. The reality, as so often in the Pacific War, proved more complex. The Japanese 50th Infantry Regiment and attached naval units totaled closer to 9,000 men, and they had spent months fortifying the island's interior with bunkers, tunnels, and prepared defensive positions that turned every ridgeline into a killing ground. By late July, Marine forces had pushed inland, compressing the Japanese into an ever-shrinking perimeter in the southern highlands. But compression created its own dangers. Trapped units became desperate, and desperate men launched night attacks. Banzai charges designed not for tactical gain, but for death with honor, not for taking as many Americans as possible into the darkness with them. The Marine Corps had encountered these attacks before, at Saipan and Guadalcanal, and had developed doctrine to counter them, interlocking fields of fire, illumination rounds, carefully registered artillery concentrations. But doctrine assumed you had support, reinforcements, communication. Doctrine assumed you weren't alone. Wittek's position was an accident of circumstance and miscommunication. His squad had been sent forward to establish an observation post on Hill 230's eastern slope, overlooking an approach route the Japanese might use to infiltrate Marine lines. They had dug in as darkness fell, setting trip wires and arranging fields of fire. Then, sometime after midnight, orders had come through garbled radio transmission to fall back to the main defensive line. In the confusion, the darkness, the terrain, the general chaos of night operations, Wojtek had been separated, left behind in a foxhole that was supposed to be abandoned, but now represented the only thing standing between a Japanese assault force and a gap in the American perimeter. He had expected something different when he enlisted in Chicago 18 months earlier. The recruiting posters showed clean Marines in dress blues. The newsreels depicted orderly advances across tropical beaches. The official rhetoric promised swift victory through American industrial might and superior training. None of it had prepared him for the reality of Pacific combat, the casual proximity of death, or the way men could be alive and laughing one moment and simply gone the next, the jungle rot and dysentery, and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from operating in 100-degree heat with inadequate water and no sleep. And none of it had prepared him for this, the absolute solitude of being alone in the dark while the enemy gathered to kill him. The first Japanese soldier appeared at 04:26 hours, materializing from the tree line like a ghost given substance. Wojtek saw him through the dim starlight, a silhouette against slightly less dark vegetation, rifle held low, moving in the cautious crouch of an experienced infantryman. Behind him, more shapes. The observation wasn't a count, but an impression. Many. Too many. They were advancing in loose skirmish formation, spacing themselves to minimize casualties from artillery or machine gun fire, moving with the quiet discipline of men who had trained for this. These weren't the desperate, psych-fueled banzai charges that Marines had learned to mow down with concentrated fire. This was a tactical infiltration, professional and methodical. Wojtek let the first man pass within 30 yards before firing. The Springfield kicked against his shoulder with familiar violence, the muzzle flashed brilliant and blinding in the darkness. The Japanese soldier dropped, but the shot had given away his position, and now the night erupted with return fire, the distinctive crack of Arisaka rifles, the deeper chatter of a Nambu machine gun, the snap of bullets passing overhead or thudding into the coral lip of his foxhole. He worked the Springfield's bolt, or the mechanical click-clack lost in the general chaos, chambered a fresh round, acquired a new target, fired again. The second man went down, but they were still coming, advancing by fire and movement, using the terrain and vegetation for cover, coordinating their assault with a competence that belied the American propaganda about Japanese incompetence. In the first 5 minutes, Wojtek fired 23 rounds, each shot requiring a complete cycle. Identify target through the muzzle flash and chaos, account for range and wind, squeeze trigger, work bolt, eject spent casing, chamber fresh round from stripper clip. His hands moved with mechanical efficiency, born from endless repetition at Camp Pendleton, and from qual ranges where instructors had screamed about sight picture and trigger discipline until the movements became neuromuscular reflex. But training hadn't captured this. The way tracer rounds drew luminous lines through the dark, the meaty thunk of bullets hitting flesh, the screaming. Always the screaming in Japanese, words he didn't understand but whose meaning transcended language. Pain, shock, the animal sounds of men dying badly. The Japanese had expected something different. Their briefings had described American Marines as physically soft, reliant on firepower rather than fighting spirit, likely to break when confronted with determined close assault. The doctrine emphasized aggressive movement and hand-to-hand combat, domains where Japanese training, with its emphasis on bayonet drill and Bushido ideology, supposedly gave them advantage. What they encountered instead was a single rifleman who shot with uncanny accuracy, who seemed to anticipate their movements, who turned their numerical superiority into a liability by forcing them into a bottleneck, where only a few could engage at once while the rest provided targets. At 04:31 hours, Wojtek's rifle ran dry. His hands moved automatically to the bandolier across his chest, extracting a stripper clip, thumbing the rounds down into the magazine with practiced pressure. 5 rounds. The Springfield held 5. American doctrine favored semi-automatic rifles like the M1 Garand, which held 8 rounds and didn't require manual bolt operation between shots. But the Corps still issued Springfields to many Marines, and the rifle had virtues. Accuracy at range, reliability in adverse conditions, a simplicity that meant it rarely failed. Those virtues mattered now as Wittek reloaded and brought the weapon back to his shoulder in a movement that took perhaps 4 seconds but felt like an eternity. The Japanese were close now, within 50 yards, close enough that he could see individual faces in the muzzle flashes. Young faces mostly, skin drawn tight over bone, eyes wide with adrenaline and fear and determination. They had fixed bayonets, the steel blades catching stray light. They were screaming now, not the formalized Banzai war cry, but something rawer, more primal. And there were so many of them, a mass of humanity flowing toward his position like a tide. Wittek understood with absolute clarity that he was going to die here, that the arithmetic didn't allow any other outcome. But understanding death and accepting it were different things, and some stubborn part of his brain refused to concede. Not yet. Not while he still had ammunition. Not while the rifle still functioned. He fired until the barrel grew hot enough to shimmer, until his shoulder was one massive bruise from recoil, until his ears stopped registering individual shots and heard only a continuous roar. The Springfield, that relic of his father's war, that obsolescent weapon the Ordnance Department had wanted to phase out, became an extension of his will, a mechanical expression of the simple refusal to quit. Each trigger press was a small act of defiance against the mathematics of overwhelming force. And each man who fell was proof that numbers alone weren't sufficient, that a single individual in the right position with adequate tools and absolute commitment could hold against impossible odds. The evidence would later be documented in the 4th Marine Division's after-action reports, now archived at the Marine Corps History Division in Quantico. Medical personnel who examined the battlefield the next morning counted 47 Japanese dead in a semicircle around Wittek's position, most within 75 yards of his foxhole. Ballistics examination of the bodies revealed that 43 had been killed by .30-06 Springfield rounds. Wittek's rifle. The remaining 4 had died from fragmentation grenades that the Marine had thrown when the enemy closed to within 30 yards. And the density of bodies created a physical barrier that impeded subsequent waves, forcing attackers to climb over their own dead, presenting themselves as targets in the process. Somewhere around 0440 hours, as Wittek fumbled to reload for perhaps the 50th time, something shifted in the Japanese assault. The coordinated advance dissolved into chaos. Men began pulling back, dragging wounded comrades, seeking cover rather than pressing forward. It wasn't a rout. The Japanese army didn't rout, but it was something close. A recognition that the attack had failed, that whatever objective they'd hoped to achieve had become impossible, that the single Marine in the foxhole represented an obstacle they couldn't overcome without casualties they couldn't afford. The silence that followed was almost worse than the combat. Wittek crouched in his hole, rifle pointed at empty darkness, every muscle locked rigid, waiting for the next wave. But it didn't come. The jungle returned to its ambient noise, insects, wind, the distant thump of artillery. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the weapon. The floor of his foxhole was carpeted with spent brass casings that gleamed dully in the growing pre-dawn light. Blood slicked his fingers, his own from where the rifle's recoil had split the web of skin between thumb and forefinger, opening and reopening the wound with each shot until his hand was a mess of torn flesh and bone-deep bruising. A canteen hung from his belt, aluminum with a canvas cover, and Wittek unclipped it with trembling hands and drank. The water was warm, tasting of metal and purification tablets, and it was the most glorious thing he had ever experienced. Water. The simple abundance of water issued to every Marine as a matter of routine, something to be drunk without thought or rationing. The Japanese soldiers lying dead in front of his position had been on half rations for weeks, their supply lines interdicted by American submarines and air attacks. They had assaulted his position while fighting thirst and hunger, while their bodies operated on reserves that were already depleted. He had fought from a position of fullness, not just the water but the ammunition, the equipment, the medical supplies that would be available if he survived to need them. The canteen became his talisman in the hours that followed, as dawn broke and revealed the full extent of the carnage. Because other Marines from his company fought their way forward to relieve what they'd assumed was an abandoned position and found instead Wojtek still alive, still conscious, still capable of challenging their approach with his rifle before recognizing friendly forces. He gripped that canteen while the corpsman checked him for wounds, while the company commander stood silent, counting bodies, while photographers attached to division headquarters snapped pictures that would eventually appear in Stars and Stripes and Life magazine, immortalizing a moment that Wojtek himself could barely remember in coherent sequence. The transformation came not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of understanding. Wojtek had been taught to see himself as part of a larger machine. Marine Corps doctrine emphasized unit cohesion, combined arms, and to the integration of infantry with armor and artillery and air support. The individual Marine mattered only as a component of the larger force. But in those 18 minutes on Hill 230, that framework had collapsed. There had been no supporting fires, no coordinated defense, no doctrine to reference. There had been only him and the rifle and the simple binary of survival or death. And he had survived not because of the machine but because of the individual. His training, yes, but also his refusal to accept predetermined outcomes, his capacity to function under stress that should have been paralyzing, his ability to transform fear into focus. The Japanese had built their entire military culture around the subordination of individual to collective, the erasure of self in service to emperor and empire. Where their soldiers were trained to embrace death, to view survival as less honorable than dying in battle. It gave them extraordinary courage, the willingness to charge machine gun positions or pilot aircraft into ships. But it also created brittleness. When tactical situations demanded adaptation or individual initiative, the system struggled to respond. Wojtek had fought as an individual, but from a culture that valued individualism, that trusted soldiers to think and adapt, that equipped them with the training and tools to make independent decisions when command structure broke down. The Medal of Honor recommendation filed by his company commander in August 1944 would be downgraded to a Navy Cross, not because the action was deemed insufficient, but because of the bureaucratic reality that the highest decorations were typically reserved for men who didn't survive to receive them, for actions that ended in death rather than survival. The Navy Cross citation, dry and formal in its language, credited Wojtek with extraordinary heroism and noted that his actions prevented enemy penetration of vital defensive positions and inflicted casualties far exceeding normal expectations for a single rifleman. The numbers were there. 47 dead, 18 minutes, 1 Marine. But the citation couldn't capture the deeper truth, that an individual, adequately equipped and sufficiently motivated, could alter outcomes that planning staffs would have deemed inevitable. After Tinian was secured, and after the B-29s began operating from Henderson Field, renamed for a commander who died in the invasion, after the atomic bombs that those B-29s would eventually carry ended the war, Wojtek returned to Chicago. He worked as a machinist, married, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke about the war. His Navy Cross sat in a drawer, unframed, the ribbon faded from dark blue to something approaching gray. When pressed by family or the occasional veterans group, he would acknowledge the action on Hill 230, but deflect questions about how it felt, what he'd been thinking, whether he'd been afraid. The truth, which he couldn't quite articulate even to himself, was that memory had compressed those 18 minutes into something dreamlike and hyper-real simultaneously, intensely vivid in certain details, while completely absent in others, as if his brain had recorded only what was necessary for survival and discarded the rest. The canteen he'd carried that night survived the war. He brought it home, dented and scarred, the canvas cover stained with substances he chose not to identify. It sat on a shelf in his garage workshop, holding paint thinner or turpentine or nothing at all, and he found himself touching it sometimes while working on projects, feeling the cool metal against his palm, remembering without quite remembering. That canteen represented something larger than simple utility. It was physical proof of the abundance that had sustained him, the logistical miracle that kept American forces supplied with water and ammunition and food across 7,000 miles of ocean. The Japanese Empire had possessed courage and tactical proficiency and initial strategic advantage, but they'd lacked the industrial capacity to sustain operations, to keep their soldiers fed and equipped and supported. They had fought brilliantly with insufficient means. America had fought adequately with overwhelming means, and in the end, overwhelming means wielded by adequate men proved sufficient. The symbolic weight of water, colorless, essential, taken for granted, mirrored the symbolic weight of American material culture. Wheatek's children grew up in a world where water flowed from taps without thought, where abundance was so commonplace it became invisible. They didn't understand why their father kept that battered canteen, or why he sometimes unscrewed the cap and sniffed inside as if the smell of 40-year-old metal could transport him somewhere. They couldn't grasp that their comfort, their safety, their freedom to grow up in a world not at war had been purchased in part by men like their father, who'd held impossible positions with obsolescent rifles and refused to quit because quitting meant the tide of history flowed differently. Hill 230 is overgrown now, returned to jungle, the foxholes filled in by decades of tropical growth and weathering. Tour groups occasionally visit Tinian, drawn by the atomic bomb pits where Little Boy and Fat Man were loaded aboard their delivery aircraft, but few venture into the interior highlands where Marines fought and died for control of terrain that mattered only until it didn't. The coral and volcanic rock hold no memory, no marker to indicate that this particular spot witnessed something extraordinary. But the absence of memorialization doesn't diminish the reality. 47 men died trying to overrun one Marine, and they failed. Wheatek himself died in 1989, quietly and without fanfare, the obituary in the Chicago Tribune mentioning his Navy Cross in a single line near the end. His children found the canteen while cleaning out his workshop, recognized it as something important, even if they couldn't fully understand why, and donated it to the National Museum of the Marine Corps, where it sits in climate-controlled storage with thousands of other artifacts from thousands of other Marines who did extraordinary things and then returned to ordinary lives. The deeper truth, and the one that transcends individual heroism or tactical analysis, is that democracy defended itself not through philosophical argument, but through the accumulated actions of men like Wheatek. Men who'd been trained adequately, equipped sufficiently, and trusted to act independently when circumstances demanded it. The Marine Corps could have court-martialed him for being separated from his unit, for failing to follow the withdrawal order, for creating a tactical liability through his isolation. Instead, they pinned a medal on his chest and held him up as an example of what American fighting men could accomplish when necessity demanded it. The Japanese soldiers who died on Hill 230 were brave men serving what they believed was a sacred cause. They charged into rifle fire because their culture demanded it, because honor required it, and because the alternative, surrender or retreat, was unthinkable. But courage without adequate support becomes waste and ideology without logistical foundation becomes futility. They fought for an empire that couldn't feed them, couldn't supply them, couldn't sustain the war their leadership had initiated. Wojtek fought for a nation that issued him water and ammunition with such profligate abundance that he could fire 200 rounds in 18 minutes and know there would be more if he needed it. 47 dead. 1 survivor. The numbers entered the record books not as triumph, but as data point, a statistical outlier in a war that generated millions of outliers, each representing a moment when the impossible briefly became actual. But the meaning persists beneath the statistics, that freedom, when tested, defended itself with individuals who refused to accept that overwhelming odds meant inevitable outcomes. That abundance of water, ammunition, training, trust in individual initiative was itself a weapon more decisive than any rifle or bomb. That a single Marine in a foxhole could embody everything the Axis powers had misunderstood about democracy, not weakness or decadence, but the terrible strength of free people fighting to remain free. The jungle breathes above Hill 230 now, indifferent and eternal. The coral dust has long since washed away, but the truth remains, held in museums and archives and fading memories. When 47 surrounded one, and the one refused to break, something more than a tactical position was defended. It was the idea itself, tested, bloodied, and validated by mathematics that should have proven it false but didn't. And that idea, carried forward by the children who never knew war, sustained by the abundance their fathers died to preserve, remains the most enduring victory of all.